So here we are, ready to start part 4 in our coverage of the book of Acts. And keep in mind that what we're trying to do here is bring it to life by tying it into other real things that we've seen out there. And the neat thing about that is if you take a look at the book of Luke and the book of Acts, that makes sort of this independent investigative reporter's account of all that time. And so we're going to pick up and look at that. In no case more than today do we find real connectivity to the world, because we're going to meet a lot of characters that appear elsewhere in history today. And in fact, if you look right here, when he was given his initial commission from the Lord said, "Go, this is my chosen instruments to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel." Well, we saw last week that he did go down and do that to the people of Israel, but today he's been arrested and he's taking a trip and going off to see the emperor. And in the process, he's going to climb the entire chain of command and meet all these kings and get a chance to speak to them. And, you know, if you think about it, what possible better way, what more brilliant way could there be for him to get to an audience with all these people in the Roman Empire that are rulers of the Roman Empire? If he had, sent out letters saying, "Hey, King Agrippa, can I come brief you? What are the chances?" Or to say to Emperor Nero, "Hey, Emperor, how about an audience? I'd like to tell you about Christianity." He'd never get that chance. But as we're going to see today, he got a chance to talk to an incredible number of people throughout the highest ranks of the Roman Empire. And that obviously had to be part of God's plan to make that possible. And all he had to do was be tied up in chains for 5 years in order to accomplish it. But he didn't seem to mind, because Jesus had already told him many, many, many times that that was exactly the plan, that he was going to be tied up in chains and he was going to take his testimony to the leadership of the Roman Empire. So he was just going along with the flow and went through a lot of things. You're going to see today he got shipwrecked, and the whole time through this catastrophic event, which is actually worthy of a Hollywood movie in terms of the intensity of it, he was calm, or everybody around him was panicked, because of course he'd been told what was coming and was prepared to endure it. I might mention that we're told what's coming too. We should be prepared to endure it. All right. So he had been saved from a mob at the temple and was hauled before the Romans, who didn't know what to do with him, so they took him to his own authorities, the Jewish Sanhedrin, which is where we pick up the story today. And so he's standing in a scene something like this. All kinds of the Jewish authorities are ready to hear the complaints against him and pronounce sentence on him. And this could be it for Paul, because it's not very hard to imagine in a scene like this that his accusers could stir up that whole government body against him, and they'd wind up ordering all kinds of things. They didn't have a law to put a man to death. That was reserved by the Romans, but they certainly could flog him and imprison him and those kind of things. So he's kind of on the spot right here. And the story tells us that as he stands up and basically says, "Hey, I'm not ashamed of what I'm doing," and he starts to talk, the high priest Ananias orders him to be struck in the mouth. Paul says to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." And everybody is standing beside him and says, hey, this is the high priest. What are you doing? And then Paul immediately switches modes and apologizes and says, I didn't realize he was the high priest, because it is written, you shall not speak evil about the ruler of your people. So he backtracks from that very quickly. But as he looks around, he decided that he would have to think of something pretty quick. And so he brilliantly recognizes that this is no different than standing before the U.S. Congress. And the best way to get out of such a thing is to say something controversial that divides the Congress. So you pick your favorite political issue. Imagine yourself standing in front of a joint session of Congress, and you stand out and you proclaim whichever side you want. Instantly, one side's going to love you and the other side's going to hate you. Right? And that's what he did. And so he knew that they were about evenly divided between Pharisees and Sadducees. And Sadducees were the skeptics of the time. They were part of the ruling body, but they didn't believe in resurrection. They didn't believe in angels or spirits. Okay, so they weren't having any of this supernatural stuff. Sound familiar? And then the other half, of course, were the Pharisees, and they did believe all these things. So when Paul stands up, and of course he's thinking about the fact that he's telling everybody that Jesus has risen, but the way he phrases it is, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." He just took sides with the Pharisees. All the Pharisees instantly loved him. All the Sadducees were out to get him. But all he did was start them arguing among themselves over this little issue. And he steps back saying, "My work here is done." And the net effect is they could not reach an agreement as to what to do about him. Half the people said, "This man's done nothing wrong." And so because of the big argument erupting all over that and emotional, the Roman authorities took him back out of there, took him back to their garrison and kept him under a lock and key while they figured out what to do about him. And then the next morning, the Jews had a plan, which was about 40 of them took an oath and said they were not going to eat or drink until they'd killed Paul. And so their plan was to call him back from the Roman garrison to the Sanhedrin, and while he was being transported, they were going to assassinate him. And they'd sworn that was what they're going to do. But something interesting happened. Paul's nephew, the son of his sister, happened to be around and overheard this plot. So he went and told Paul. Paul said, "Well, you go tell your story to the centurion." He told the centurion, and this is what the centurion said: "Don't tell anybody else about this." And then he gave the orders: prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen, and go to Caesarea at 9 o'clock tonight. Take Paul there. You got to love the Romans, don't you? I mean, when they decide to do something, they do it right. They're not going to send just a few soldiers to guard him. If there's 40 people out there getting ready to ambush him, they're going to make sure that there's no fight. And so if you're 40 guys lying in wait and you see this kind of a force with Paul, they put Paul on a horse, okay? And so there's really no way that's going to happen. And they took him to Caesarea, which is clear up there. Now, they didn't make it all in one night. The Bible says that they took off from Jerusalem and they went to kind of a halfway point in a place called Antipatris. And if you want to get an idea about that I've superimposed Floyd County onto this map. Okay, so essentially it was a trip about equivalent of going from Floyd to Christiansburg on their way to Roanoke. Okay, so that was what they set out to do. Of course, this force had people on foot, so that imagine setting out at 9 o'clock at night for Christiansburg on foot. Right? So those soldiers did that march all night long, and they got there the next morning and turned around, and everybody who was on foot turned around and went home because they'd gotten him out of the area, past the big risk. But they kept the 70 horsemen, and the rest of them pressed on the next day to Caesarea, which is kind of like the state capital, the capital of Judea. That's where we have two different types of rulers. We have the local king of Judea, who was a member of Abraham's race, and we have also the Roman governor. is located at this same location. Okay, so the Romans had a habit of having a governor, but leaving the local puppets, if you will, in place, and they let the puppets deal with the details of the culture and governing of that local people. And the Romans governor was a chance to supervise the puppets and decide anything that Romans reserved for themselves, like capital punishment, that sort of thing. So that is where Paul wound up. And then something interesting happened. Paul's up there, probably scratching his head about what's going on. He's got a general idea of what God has in mind, but it tells us something fascinating. It says, the following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Wouldn't you love to have God appear to you and tell you what his plan is ahead of time? Wouldn't that take a lot of uncertainty out of it? Well, in Paul's case, because of the things he was about to endure, it's really good that he got that little piece of information. But I'd like you to think about something. You were talking about, before class started, about the Trinity and how God is three persons but one. How does he appear at? It says, using the same words that we hear in the Old Testament, the Lord did this, the Lord did that. And here, the Lord stood near Paul and said, fascinating things. He stood near him and said. So this is a physically embodiment, right? This is not something like a pillar of fire that we might have seen during the Exodus, right? This is a person who suddenly stood near him and talked to him. And the Bible gives us some hints of what that must have been like. It doesn't tell us much in this particular passage other than it was a human-looking person, one like the Son of Man, standing beside him. And we know from some other examples that, well, for example, after Jesus was resurrected and he reappeared to the apostles, and specifically doubting Thomas, he was wearing a physical body. He was able to walk through walls, but he was able to demonstrate the wounds. So his body looked like a real human, and yet he could appear and disappear at will. And the disciples could touch him. He could eat fish. So this new spiritual body that Jesus has some interesting properties. It can come and go, and it can look just like an ordinary person, and it can also do supernatural things. We have other examples of that in the book of Daniel, right towards the last few chapters. Angels appear on the river, and there's this angel that talks to him standing on the water and telling him a lot of things that are going to happen. And the description of that person, it's clear that person is not Jesus. That's an angel. We know that because the angel tells us that he was delayed by a spirit in Persia until Michael the archangel came to help him. And then he was finally able to get through to Daniel. Okay, we know the Lord Jesus would not have been delayed by anything he's created, and would not have needed the help of Michael. So we know that this is not. And yet the description of this particular being, in terms of his fiery nature and what he's wearing and everything, sounds an awful lot like the description of Jesus that we get in the book of Revelation. I just wanted to share that with you as sort of an aside here. This is what John saw when he encountered Jesus the same way, presumably, that Paul had encountered him. It was in a vision, but in reality, how do we tell a difference between a vision and a Christophany, an appearance of Christ apparently in the flesh? Paul himself says, whether in the body or out of the body, I know not, but I had this experience. Right? So when we start encountering God, it's hard to tell what's a vision and what's not, what's a dream, and so on. But this is what John experienced when he saw him. He says this is the very first chapter of the book of Revelation. He says, I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me. And when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and among the lampstands was someone like the Son of Man. Someone looks human, who was dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool. Apparently this artist didn't get the memo.
He's got a halo.
And as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace. And his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in all its brilliance. One of the things that Jesus prayed before his crucifixion to God, he says, I pray that they could see my glory. Okay. These things in this description are part of that glory. He may look like a human, but there's this radiance to him that's hard to describe, but we see it happening many times. It was described in Daniel, described here. And the thing that I find exciting is what John later said in one of his epistles. He said this, Beloved, now we are the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Okay, so, when we get our new version 2.0 bodies after the resurrection, we're going to have, not the scale probably of what he has, but nevertheless, we're going to have bodies like that and be like him in this new spiritual way. So really exciting when you think about that. Every time we hear about Jesus taking and interacting with the Apostle Paul or one of these spiritual beings, it gives us a hint of what's in store for us if we hang in there. So that was a little free extra insert into the book of Acts, no extra charge. After he gets to Caesarea, up on the coast of the Mediterranean, several days later the governor shows up with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. And he sent for Paul and basically listened to his testimony. Drusilla is an interesting case. She's a daughter of King Herod and Jewish, and by all accounts, she was gorgeous. The best-looking woman in all the land is the way Josephus described her. And Governor Felix noticed her and decided that he wanted her for his wife, so he made her an offer she couldn't refuse and convinced her to divorce her current Jewish husband, who was a minor king or authority in the area, and marry him. So she's sitting there now. She's the youngest daughter of Herod Agrippa, and the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great. She had 2 sisters, Miriam and Bernice, and we're going to meet Bernice again at the next meeting Paul has on his next trial. Bernice will be there. So these sisters get around because they're part of the local royalty, the local ruling dynasty of Herod. And one other little tidbit about her is that many years later, she was at Pompeii in 79 A.D. when Mount Vesuvius erupted. Now, Pam and I were there and got a chance to see Pompeii as it is. But at the time it erupted, everything happened so fast that basically 6 to 10 feet of hot ash with noxious carbon monoxide and all kinds of other poisonous gases just came out of the mountain and settled down on everybody without any notice. And what that did was bury people alive. And what they have done, the archaeologists have found at the base of this thing that there were cavities in that all settled down and sort of turned into a porous hard pack, if you will. And so every place they found one of these cavities, they injected concrete plaster kind of material down into all those cavities and filled them up before they cleared everything away. Then after they cleared away the ash, what they found was where the bodies was. The bodies had long decomposed, but they made castor molds of the cavities where the ash had settled down and buried them. So we can kind of see what their state was at the time this all happened. And that was the fate of Bernice. She was one of two famous people killed in the Pompeii event. The other one...
Fate of Drusilla.
Drusilla, yeah. What did I say?
Bernice.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Drusilla, when she was much older, and her son were killed there. The only other famous person was somebody named Pliny the Younger. And if you've never heard of him, that's okay. But the point is, she was still pretty famous, even in 79 AD, that history would take note of the fact that she perished in that event. Anyhow, Paul is meeting with real people that have real historical footprints, and that makes this whole history come to life even more. Now, Paul got a chance to testify to Felix, and he scared him. The Bible says he trembled. Okay, Felix was not a good dude. I mean, he was one of these guys who had nothing that he wouldn't do. He lived a life of debauchery and preyed on the people under his command. He was not a good guy. But Paul got to him enough to scare him. Not enough to get him to convert, but enough to scare him. He kept Paul in prison for 2 years. And what the Bible tells us is that why he was keeping you in prison was he was hoping to get a bribe. He was known for taking bribes. And he said, I'm going to keep you in prison until your supporters come along and give me a nice payment, and then I'll let you out. And he went on like that for a couple years until finally he was relieved of command. He had done something, and the Romans replaced him with a person named Festus. And no, he's not the guy from Gunsmoke. But he was another replacement governor who came in and took over. And as Felix left, relieved of command, he left Paul in jail for Festus to deal with. And so eventually Festus got around to basically doing the trial all over again. He called the Jews back from Jerusalem and let them press charges. And Paul says, nope, they don't have any evidence whatsoever. And Festus says, well, how about if I send you back to stand trial in Jerusalem with your own people? And Paul says, no. There's nothing in Roman law that says you can do this to me. I'm a Roman citizen, and I appeal to Caesar, which were the magic words which prevented him from having to go back where he would have obviously not done well back in Jerusalem. But in this case, because he appealed to Caesar, they says, all right, you've appealed to Caesar you will go. But when you send somebody to Caesar, you have to write a letter with accusations on it. He couldn't think of anything to really valid to say about Paul other than his local religious authorities didn't agree with some of the things he said. So he was trying to figure out what to do, and he happened to have a meeting with King Agrippa, who, the new Roman governor shows up, the local king has to show up and pay his respects to the new Roman governor. And that's what happened. King Agrippa shows up and shows up with this Bernice, who's the older sister of Drusilla that we'd seen before. And so they showed up, and while they were there, Festus says, hey, I got this guy in prison. I'd like to hear your opinion on it. And Agrippa says, yeah, that sounds interesting. Okay, I'll stick around. Let's hear what he has to say. King Agrippa II was actually, his father was Herod Agrippa I, who was the guy that executed the Apostle James and put Peter into prison when we heard about that. So this is a little bit later. That guy's died. His son is now in charge. His great-grandfather was Herod the Great, the guy who had killed all the babies when Jesus was less than 2 years old, trying to snuff out Jesus. His uncle was Herod Antipas, the guy who beheaded John the Baptist, and was the guy that tried Jesus for Pilate when Pilate sent him off to King Herod. So all those guys in this dynasty were not even Israelites. They were descendants of Esau, and therefore part of the line that leads to Muhammad and Islam and everything. And here they are in charge, and they're more interested in power than they are interested in preserving Jewish traditions. But to stay in power, they do things for the Jews to make themselves popular. Good example was Herod the Great built that new fancy big temple. that everybody was admiring when Jesus and his disciples were around. Meanwhile, Bernice was the widow of her uncle. She married her uncle, Herod Agrippa I. And then when he died, she became the mistress of her brother, Agrippa II. Okay? And, spent most of her life living in his court. But nevertheless, when General Titus shows up, and he's the guy that destroyed Jerusalem in 70 A.D., and so when he showed up, she became his mistress as well. She is known as sort of a minor Cleopatra figure, and she was rich enough that she actually was influential enough in tipping the scale as to who, back in Rome, got to be emperor or not. She would, basically contribute to his campaign with whatever influence she had, and she was rich enough to make a difference. And in this relationship, Herod and she wielded almost equal power. Okay, so she was a very powerful lady at the time, and Paul is standing up and briefing the two of them. Well, she obviously had mastered the art.
I would say I doubt very seriously she did it totally with verbiage, but
Yeah. This is a great example of where Saul will bear my name before the Gentiles and the kings of the sons of Israel. There we are. And so that's what all is happening. Just another piece of evidence that this guy was real. He was real enough for us to still have one of those famous Roman busts of his face. Okay, so he was a big dude. And they stood in front of him, and as Paul is explaining all of this, and every time Paul's on trial, he's telling his whole story about his life as a Pharisee, about how he was converted on the road to Damascus, how he was sent to the Gentiles. That whole thing is a chance for him to actually, as he tells his life story in his defense, he's also telling about Jesus to these people who have to sit there and listen to him and try to figure out whether or not he's in trouble. At some point, Festus, the Roman governor, had had enough. And he shouts out, "You're out of your mind, Paul. Your great learning is driving you insane." Now, points out that he noticed that Paul was very smart, right? All the stuff Paul's talking about, it definitely showed great learning. After all, he was the top Pharisee in his class. But he says, "No, I'm not insane, most excellent Festus. What I'm saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I'm convinced that none of this has escaped his notice, because it was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do." Paul's really a master of all this, right? He's being politically correct and talking to these guys, showing them respect, and pushing their buttons because he knows what their background is and how to communicate with them. And then Agrippa says something really amazing. He says, "Then Agrippa said to Paul, 'You almost persuade me to be a Christian.'" This is the saddest thing he ever said, because almost persuaded is no better than never hearing the word at all. He was on the very cusp of an eternal, life-changing event and fell short. Paul said, "I would to God that not only you, but also all that hear me in this day were both almost and altogether such as I am, except for these chains." So he's done his job. He's made his case. He's almost persuaded some of them. And who knows who else he persuaded. Everybody else sitting around in there listening to that defense got to hear this in a most important kind of way. And maybe some of them heard. But that was part of what God's plan was. Now we get to the actual journey to Rome. And I'm not going to take you through that, but it's worth your time. It's only one chapter in the book of Acts. But it reads like an adventure. And it's got kind of details. He talks about the names of the ship owners. It's really fascinating because on this whole trip through here, the centurion that's in charge is essentially going to cities, looking around for a boat, chartering the boat, loading his passengers on. He's taken a number of prisoners with him, plus the soldiers, plus Paul. So he's got this group of people that he's got to book on this series of ships. And back then, they didn't have any other way to do it other than to show up, find out what ships were in port, investigate where they were going, find one, make a deal, and that means that this centurion is carrying with him enough cash to be able to pay for all his crews to get on the different ships and travel. And as he goes along, he treats Paul pretty nice. When they stop up here in Lycia, he was met by some believers who were allowed to meet his needs and refresh him. I don't know what that means. Maybe he got a bed, bath, and shower for a night. I don't know. But the point is, this is on the part of Asia that Paul had spent years evangelizing in. So there were believers all over the place, and some of them locally here said, "Hey, Paul's in town." And so he had a chance to spend a little time with them. Then they set off, went to a number of places that's very interesting as he names the cities along the way. Stopped off at this port called Fair Havens, and it was getting late in the year, stormy winter weather happening, and Fair Havens was a lousy port to spend the winter in. So they really wanted to press on. They were going to go over to this other port called, I think it's Phoenix or something, over on the west end of Crete. So they thought, we'll make one more hop before we have to spend the winter there, because that'd be a better place to spend. They set out to sea, got caught in a storm, and swept out to sea where they couldn't even control things. They were in such bad weather they couldn't see the sun or the stars. They couldn't navigate, had no idea where they were, and all they could do was take down their sails to keep them from getting ripped off and let the storm drive them wherever. And that went on for many days. I think it says towards the end of it here, it had been 15 days, nobody had eaten anything, probably because they were all seasick from the little boat bobbing. Something else I found interesting, it says 276 souls were on that ship. That's 2/3 of a 747. This is a big ship for that time, right? A lot of people. Anyhow, they eventually got blown ashore and shipwrecked in Malta. And it gives us the story of him going up to Sicily. While they were at Malta, he got bit by a snake. Everybody saw this snake viper hanging off his hand. He shakes it off into the fire, and everybody thinks that he's going to die because he's been shipwrecked, and now he's been snake bitten. He must be a bad guy. But nothing happens to him, and so they change their mind and decide he's a god. Anyhow, they give him a nice few days there to rest up, and then the whole entourage gets on another ship. They work their way up between Italy and Sicily, past a little, Pam and I went through there on a cruise ship. There's, right out there in the middle of the water, this volcano sticking up, puffing smoke. And so we went right by that, and apparently so did Paul on his particular trip. On up, came ashore at a port south of Rome and took the Appian Way up to Rome. And when they got to Rome, Paul was put in house arrest. He basically got to rent a house and stay there, not in a dungeon, just a place he was renting. And the only constraint was he had to have a Roman soldier tied to him 24/7 by a chain. But other than that, he was free to meet with people, do business, write, whatever he wanted to do. And that lasted for 2 solid years. And the last thing we have from Dr. Luke, clearly during this time, Luke had probably sat down and he probably wrote the book of Acts during this 2-year period. Just thinking back over everything he's done. He's got it all done. He's at this point, has no idea how much longer Paul's going to be in prison, and finally decides to publish it. So he sends it off to wherever he sent it and into history. And so we don't know what happened after that, because if he did add anything to a follow-on version of it, we don't have that. We have whatever he had written as of this time and that he published. And so the last thing Luke has to tell us is for 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. And that's where Luke leaves it. But we can find out a little bit more about what that was like, because when Paul was there, he wrote 4 books of the Bible while he was sitting there chained up in this house. And the books of the Bible he wrote were Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. And Philippians written probably around 62 A.D., the other 3 written the year before that. And in Philippians, the very first chapter of that book, Paul actually gives us a little bit more information about what was going on for him. He says, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me was actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it's become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear." Okay, so he'd set a good example. Everybody else saw what Paul was doing. And Paul was this bald-headed little man. He's not an impressive dude. And yet he was, making such a big difference. Everybody else was inspired by that. And as people were coming by to see him all this time, having meetings with him, you can imagine any Christian in that area sooner or later would say, "Hey, I want to go talk to this Paul." So a lot of people came by to see him, and he was making the same kind of difference. You might even think running a seminary in Rome, where people would come by, people who were serious about it, and get an advanced education from Paul. And the whole time Paul's doing this, guess who's also getting an education? Yeah. The member of the Praetorian Guard who's tied up with him. They took turns, 4-hour shifts. Okay, so for 2 years, 4 hours a day, 24/7, it's over 4,000 Praetorian Guards. There were 10,000 of them total. So 40%, I assume that the Lord chose which 40%, had to spend 4 hours chained to the Apostle Paul, where they heard what he was telling, watched what he was writing, and no doubt every single one of them got their own personal little witness, where Paul would tell them why he was in chains and what he believed and what the good news was. Now, these Praetorian Guards were the best of the best. You could think of them as Caesar's Secret Service. They were handpicked best. You could think of them as Navy SEALs, special ops kind of guys. They were the best of the best. And they had this really nice gig. They served for 12 years, and then they retired on a full retirement salary. So here's all these really smart, capable, respected people who, after they got retired, had nothing better to do than live in Rome and get involved in politics and be influential and that sort of thing. And so all these people that he's training up are Caesar's household, are going out and doing the most influential things. So who knows how many times Christians encountered the Roman government, which was led by these guys. Okay, so in fact, they had so much power they actually controlled who got to be emperor next. You didn't get elected emperor if the Praetorian Guard were not on your side. So that brings us then to the summary of Paul's last days. We've just looked at this period of time in yellow down here in 61 and 62, where he's been in jail. But after this, Paul gets released and is free to roam around among the churches for a few more years. And that's when he wrote Timothy and Titus from Macedonia. Then he's imprisoned again by Nero in around 65. He's in jail. He writes Timothy, and then sometime around 67 AD, he's actually martyred. And our last words from Paul when he's in that final prison waiting execution, he says, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time of my departure is near. I've fought the good fight, I've finished the race, I've kept the faith, and now there is in store for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also all who have longed for his appearance." So there we have kind of the last words. It's kind of interesting if you look in Timothy. He's basically saying, do your best to come quickly to Timothy. And then he goes down and he talks about what has happened to different people he's worked with, from Thessalonica, Galatia, Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark. and bring him with you. I sent Tychus to Ephesus and Carpus at Troas. Greet Priscilla and Aquila. And there, Erastus is in Corinth, and Trophimus is sick in Miletus, where he had the speech to the Ephesian elders, and it goes on and names a lot of other people. So we kind of get the final snapshot of where everybody is and so on. But Paul, kind of all alone. Only Dr. Luke is staying with him and writing this letter to Timothy asking for some help. And we know that he got out because he says at his first defense, no one came to his support. But he was delivered from the lion's mouth thanks to the work of the Lord. And the Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. So he's looking now, I've wrapped up, I've done all my work. And so the last thing we know about him is that he's executed for his beliefs. So on top of everything else he accomplished, he got to die a martyr's death, which in the overall things, rather than dying of old age, he got to go pretty quickly and join the Lord. So it may sound like a horrible thing, but actually it's a nice exclamation point to put onto his career. So there you go. We've taken the tour of a lot of different places and seen a lot of things. And the important thing to remember is that all of this stuff is very real. And the book of Acts is one of the great books for people who are wondering if this is real or just made up, because it ties everything together with real historical events. The credibility that Luke, as an independent Greek writer and investigative reporter, are unassailable. And so anytime you have somebody that's got a hard time understanding it, you might want to recommend that they start out reading the book of Acts, because it ties it into, makes it all real. And then they can have the increased faith to read a lot of the other things that have less outside the Bible evidence. And that concludes this particular session. Anybody got any questions?
How old was Paul, do you think, when he was martyred?
Boy, I think if 67 AD, I'll bet you he was roughly 67 plus or minus 10 years. So he had pretty much used up a full life for that day and age, and it had been a pretty rough life on him. So he probably didn't have too many years left anyway, although certainly John continued to live on for another generation after that, because he didn't die until 95 AD or so.
So the curious mind wants to know what happened to the Jews who promised an oath not to eat or drink until they killed Paul.
Oh, wouldn't we love to know that? Let's hope they all starved to death.